He stepped down from the mail wagon at the North Fork Depot with his right sleeve pinned flat against his side. And Grace Holloway, who had promised herself weeks ago that whatever the war sent home to her, she would be standing on that platform to receive it, felt her whole, carefully steadied composure crack straight down the middle at the sight of him. She had spent those 2 years of his absence learning to read casualty lists the way other women read scripture, searching each new sheet posted outside the telegraph office for a name she prayed never to find, and finding instead, twice, wounds severe enough to still her heart before a second look confirmed it was some other woman's grief and not her own. She had trained as a nurse in that waiting, first out of restless need for some use to put her fear to, and later because the town's only doctor, old and overworked, had come to rely on her steady hands and steadier nerves more than either of them had expected when she'd first offered to help. She had told herself, through every long month of it, that whatever came home to her from that war, whole or wounded or not at all, she would meet it standing, because a woman who ran from hard news had already lost something a great deal harder to recover than any single limb. Asa Redmond had left North Fork 2 years past a whole man, broad-shouldered and easy-laughing, the same man who'd slipped a plain gold band onto her finger the night before he rode off to join his company, promising her a wedding the moment the fighting ended. The man who climbed down from that wagon now moved like someone carrying a weight far heavier than the small canvas bag in his one remaining hand, his face gone gaunt and shuttered, his eyes finding hers across the platform, and then, deliberately, sliding away. Asa. She was across the boards before she decided to move, her nurse's training doing what her heart alone might have hesitated over, reaching for him with both hands before some instinct in his bearing stopped her an arm's length short. Thank God you're home." "You shouldn't have come," he said low, not quite meeting her eyes. "I wrote you not to come. You wrote me a letter telling me you were released from your obligation to me, Asa Redmond, and I burned it in the stove, because I never once agreed to be released from anything." She kept her voice steady, though her hands were shaking at her sides. "I've been the town's nurse 2 years now waiting on you. Did you think a missing arm would be the thing that finally sent me running?" Something moved behind his eyes, not gladness, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, but something closer to grief. He reached into his coat pocket with his one hand, fumbling a moment with the awkwardness of a task that had once taken two, and drew out the ring he'd given her 2 years before, the very one she'd mailed back to him in protest when his letter came, which he had apparently mailed straight back to her again, unwilling to keep what he no longer believed himself entitled to. "Take it back properly this time, Grace. Please. I can't ask you to spend your life fetching for half a man who can't work his own land or lift his own child or do one blessed thing the way it ought to be done. You deserve whole, and I've nothing whole left to offer you." She looked at the ring in his open palm, and then at his face, drawn tight with a shame so complete it had apparently convinced him wholesale that her love had been for his 2 arms and not for the man carried between them. "I did not fall in love with your arm, Asa Redmond," she said, quiet and fierce both. "I fell in love with the man who read to old Widow Tanner every Sunday because her eyes had gone too weak for her Bible, and the man who broke a green colt, so gentle the animal never once needed the whip. I don't believe that man went missing along with your arm, whatever you've convinced yourself of in some army hospital tent, but I can see you're not ready to believe me yet, so I won't fight you on a train platform." She closed his fingers back over the ring with both her hands. "Keep it a while longer. I'm not going anywhere, and neither, I suspect, is my mind on the matter." He said nothing further, only climbed into the wagon his younger sister Mercy had brought to fetch him, and Grace watched them drive off toward the Redmond homestead with a hollow ache in her chest that felt, disturbingly, like grief for a man not yet lost, only badly wounded in places no bandage could reach. The homestead, when Grace called at it 3 days later on the pretense of checking Mercy's winter cough, told its own story of neglect plainer than any words could have. Fences sagged unmended along the near pasture. The barn roof wanted shingling before the first hard snow. Mercy Redmond, only 19, and doing the work of 2 grown men since their father's death the previous winter, looked thin and worn past her years, and greeted Grace at the door with undisguised relief. "He won't hardly leave his room," Mercy said low, glancing back toward the closed door at the end of the hall. "Won't see the hands about the cattle, won't touch the account books, won't do anything but sit and stare out at land he says he's no use to any more. I don't know how we'll manage the note come spring if he doesn't rouse himself, Grace, and I don't know how to rouse him." "What note?" Mercy's face tightened. "Silas Crandall holds a note against the West Section, from when Father borrowed against a bad year. He's been sniffing round asking after Asa's condition ever since word came he was wounded, and I don't think it's brotherly concern moving him. Crandall's wanted our water frontage on the creek for years." Grace felt the cold, familiar anger she reserved for men who circled the wounded like buzzards circled the dying, and resolved, standing in that neglected dooryard, that she would not let either Silas Crandall's greed or Asa Redmond's despair win the argument they seemed determined to have over a life still very much worth fighting for. The town's murmuring reached her before the week was out. She heard it plainest at the Mercantile, where 2 farmers' wives paused their conversation only briefly when she entered, resuming it in lowered but still audible tones once they believed her occupied among the dry goods. "A pity what's become of him," one said, "though I hear he can barely manage a fork these days, let alone a ranch. Poor Mercy Redmond will be run into the ground, trying to hold that place together around a brother who won't even leave his room." Grace said nothing, paid for her thread, and walked the whole way back to the homestead with her jaw set tight, understanding for the first time just how much of Asa's battle would have to be fought not only against his own despair, but against a valley all too ready to write him off before he'd had a fair chance to prove otherwise. She found Asa in his room exactly as Mercy described, sitting in a chair angled toward the window, his empty sleeve pinned neat and careful in a way that spoke of a man still trying, in small, dignified ways, to hold himself together, even as larger things came apart around him. "Mercy tells me you won't touch the account books," Grace said, without preamble, setting her bag down and pulling a second chair up beside his. "I can't hold a pen steady enough to make the figures legible." "Then I'll hold the pen, and you'll tell me the figures, and between the 2 of us we'll manage a task that used to take 1 man alone." She opened her bag and withdrew paper and ink before he could object further. "I didn't come today to nurse a cough that Mercy doesn't actually have, Asa. I came because a homestead is failing around 2 people I care for, and I find I'm not made the kind of woman who watches that happen from a safe distance out of politeness." He was quiet a long moment, and she thought he might send her away outright, but something in the plain practicality of her offer, not pity, not romance, only work needing doing, seemed to reach him where gentler approaches had failed. He told her the figures, haltingly at first and then, with more of his old steadiness returning as the numbers gave his mind somewhere useful to stand. And by the time she left that evening, the account book showed a clearer accounting than it had in a year. And Asa Redmond had spoken more words to another living soul than Mercy said he'd managed in a fortnight. It became, after that, a quiet daily habit that neither of them named aloud. Grace came most afternoons after her nursing rounds in town, and found small, honest tasks to draw him from his chair the account books at first, then correspondence he could dictate while she wrote, then, as autumn wore toward winter, Small practical experiments in what a man with one arm could still accomplish if he was willing to find a new way of accomplishing it. She rigged a harness from old leather that let him hold a rope steady against his body while his good hand worked the knot. She found, at the mercantile, a specially balanced hatchet that split kindling one-handed with less strain than he expected. She never once told him these were meant to prove anything. She presented each as simple practicality and let him discover for himself slowly that the discovering felt like something close to hope. Silas Crandall did not share the town's growing tenderness toward the Redmond homestead's small recovery. He called at the ranch himself one gray November afternoon, ostensibly to inquire after Asa's health, though his eyes moved the whole visit over the mended fence line and the newly shingled barn roof with an assessing coldness that made Grace, present that day helping Mercy with the wash, deeply uneasy. "I'd hoped we might discuss the note before it comes due in spring," Crandall said to Asa, who had, at Grace's quiet urging, come out onto the porch to receive the visit himself rather than let Mercy handle it alone. "A man in your condition, Redmond, might find it easier to simply sell the west section now, at a fair price, rather than risk a default that would cost you the whole homestead come the deadline." "My condition," Asa repeated flat, "hasn't touched my ability to read a calendar or count $1, Crandall. The note's not due till April, and I mean to have it paid by then, same as my father would have." "A man with one arm running cattle through a hard winter is a considerable gamble," Crandall said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "I'd hate to see Mercy left with nothing if the gamble doesn't pay." Grace, standing at the porch rail with a basket of wet linens forgotten in her hands, felt something in her chest go sharp and clear. "Mr. Crandall, I've nursed half this valley through fevers and broken bones these 2 years, and I've yet to see a man's worth measured honestly by his arm count, rather than his character. I think a neighbor genuinely concerned for this family's welfare might offer help rather than a purchase offer timed suspiciously close to a man's lowest hour." Crandall's smile thinned considerably, and he took his leave shortly after, but Grace saw, in the tight set of Asa's jaw as he watched the man ride off, something that looked almost like the return of an old, useful anger. The kind that gave a man reason to prove a doubter wrong rather than simply confirm his doubts by giving up. Crandall did not let the matter rest there. Within the fortnight, word reached Mercy through a cousin who clerked at the stockyard that Crandall had been quietly suggesting to the buyers who handled the Redmond cattle contracts each season that a one-armed rancher's stock might not be worth the same premium this year, on account of uncertain handling and thinner herds expected from a short-handed outfit. It was the kind of rumor that cost nothing to spread and a great deal to disprove, and Grace watched Asa's jaw tighten reading the letter Mercy brought him, watched him fold it once, twice, with a precision that spoke of controlled fury rather than the old despair. "He means to squeeze me from every side he can reach," Asa said. "The note in spring and the herd's price come autumn both, so that whichever doesn't finish me, the other will." "Then we'll answer both," Grace said, "same as we've answered everything else this fall plainly, and without giving him the satisfaction of watching us flinch." She helped him draft a letter of his own that week, direct to the stockyard buyers, laying out honestly the improvements made to the herd's care since his return, and inviting any buyer with doubts to come inspect the stock themselves before the spring sale rather than trust a neighbor's second-hand word. 3 buyers took him up on the offer before Christmas, and left satisfied enough that the rumor, deprived of the uncertainty it fed on, began to lose its hold on the valley's gossip. It was a small victory, and Grace understood it as such even as she celebrated it with him. Crandall's note still loomed, the debt still real, the man himself clearly not finished testing whatever weakness he believed the war had left behind in the Redmond family. But small victories, she had learned nursing broken men home from distant battles, were very often the only kind that mattered in the slow work of healing, one honest proof at a time. Winter closed hard over Norfolk that year, and Asa Redmond surprised the whole valley, Grace included, with how thoroughly he threw himself into disproving Silas Crandall's quiet prophecy. He rode out with the hands most mornings now, directing what he could no longer do himself with a precision that earned him a grudging new respect among men who'd once whispered pity behind his back. He argued with Grace over harness rigging until they found something that worked better than either had proposed alone. He laughed, one evening in December, at something Mercy said over supper, and Grace, catching the sound of it, felt her whole chest ache with a hope she'd been rationing carefully for months. But hope, Grace was learning, did not travel in a single steady direction with a man carrying wounds as deep as Asa's. She found him alone on the porch one bitter evening in mid-December, well after Mercy had gone to bed, staring out at the dark shape of the barn against a sky gone hard and starless, and something in his stillness struck her as different from his ordinary quiet. "You're out here without a coat," she said, draping her own shawl uselessly small across his shoulders anyway. "I keep thinking on the men who didn't come home at all," he said, not looking at her. "Good men, better men than me by most measures, buried where they fell because there was no one left standing to carry them back. And here I am, come home whole enough to complain about an arm, wondering some nights whether I oughtn't have stayed with them instead of taking up space among the living while doing so poor a job of it." He said it quietly, without drama, which frightened her a great deal more than if he'd shouted it. "I don't mean anything reckless by it, Grace. I only mean I don't always know, some nights, what claim I've got left to a full life, when so many better men lost theirs entirely." She sat with him a long while in the cold, saying nothing further that night, understanding that some griefs wanted only witness rather than argument, and resolving privately, walking home alone under that same hard sky, that she would watch him more closely than she had let herself admit was necessary, because a man who spoke so calmly of his own dispensability was a man standing closer to some private edge than his daytime steadiness let on. 3 days later, against all expectation, Asa agreed to attend the small Christmas social held at the Norfolk Church Hall, the first town gathering he'd consented to join since his return. He stood somewhat apart from the dancing at first, watching rather than participating, until old Widow Tanner herself, guided by her granddaughter, sought him out specifically to thank him for the letters he'd written her faithfully throughout the war, describing the sky and the seasons in place of the scripture her failing eyes could no longer read alone. Grace, watching from across the hall, saw something loosen in Asa's shoulders at the old woman's plain, unforced gratitude, saw him laugh, genuinely, at some remark of the girl's, and understood that small unglamorous kindnesses remembered were doing a slower, deeper work on him than any grand gesture might have managed. He found Grace near the cider table before the evening ended, and for the first time since his return, reached for her hand with his own without any hesitation clouding the gesture. "I'd forgotten," he said, "how it feels to be looked at as a neighbor rather than a curiosity. I've Widow Tanner to thank for reminding me, and you, I suspect, for arranging that I'd be here to be reminded." "I arranged nothing, Asa Redmond. I only refused to let you talk yourself out of attending, which is a considerably smaller thing than you're crediting me for." "It's not smaller to me," he said, quiet enough that the words were meant only for her amid the fiddle music and laughter filling the hall. "Nothing you've done this autumn has felt smaller to me, Grace, whatever plain practicality you've dressed it up as." He held her hand a moment longer than the crowded hall strictly permitted, and Grace, walking home under a clear, cold sky that night with her hand still warm from his, allowed herself, for the first time since the train platform, to believe wholeheartedly that the man she loved might yet find his way all the way back to himself. But despair, Grace had learned nursing broken men home from that war, rarely surrendered so easily or so completely, and it returned to Asa on the worst night of that winter with a viciousness that nearly cost them everything. A storm blew down off the ridge 2 nights before Christmas, lightning cracking close enough to shake the windows, and Grace, staying late at the homestead to see Mercy through a fright of nerves the weather always brought her, was the one who first smelled smoke on the wind and understood, with a lurch of pure terror, what it meant. "The barn," she said, already moving for the door. "Mercy, the barn's caught." They ran out into driving rain to find the old structure already well alight along its western wall, lightning struck and burning fast in the wind, the horses within screaming with a sound that raised the hair on Grace's arms. Asa was ahead of both women before Grace had fully registered him moving, sprinting for the barn doors with the same reckless speed she remembered from a man who'd once broken green colts without a thought for his own safety. Except now, he had only one arm to manage a task that would have strained two. Asa, no. He was already inside, and Grace, screaming his name into wind that swallowed the sound whole, understood in that instant something about him she should have understood weeks before. That some part of him had gone into that burning barn not merely to save the horses, but to finally settle, one way or another, whether the man left after the war was worth the saving at all. She was not going to let him settle that question alone, and she was not going to let him settle it wrong. Grace tore a strip from her own petticoat, soaked it in the rain barrel by the door, and pressed it over her mouth and nose before Mercy could stop her, plunging into smoke and heat that stung her eyes to streaming within seconds. She found Asa on the far side of the barn, one hand fighting a length of rope loose from a panicked mare's halter, the fire spreading fast along the loft above them both, and she did not waste breath on argument. "The rope now, Asa, I've got her other side." Together, working with a coordination born of months of finding new ways to accomplish old tasks, they freed the mare and drove her stamping and wild-eyed out into the rain, and turned back for the second horse still screaming in the smoke-thick dark. It was as they reached the last stall that the loft above them groaned, a long tearing sound Grace felt in her teeth before she understood what it meant, and she had time only to shove Asa hard sideways before a burning beam crashed down where he'd been standing, catching his leg beneath a lighter cross-timber that pinned him, cursing and struggling, to the barn floor. "Grace, get out, get clear now." She did not get clear. She threw her whole weight against the fallen timber, found it would not shift for her alone, and grabbed instead a fence rail leaning nearby to use as a lever, exactly as she'd once seen a doctor free a trapped miner's leg 2 winters back, wedging it beneath the beam and throwing every ounce of her strength against it while smoke rolled thick above them both. "Push with me," she gasped. "Asa, push." He pushed, his one good arm braced hard against the barn floor, and between her lever and his strength, the beam shifted enough for him to drag his leg free, and they went stumbling and choking together out into the rain not 30 seconds before the loft gave way entirely behind them, collapsing the barn's western half into a roaring column of sparks that the storm itself seemed to fight against, rain hissing white against the flames. Mercy, who had stayed behind at Grace's shouted order to ring the yard bell and rouse the nearest hands, had the freed mare already haltered and calming by the paddock fence, and came running the moment she saw the two of them stumble clear, her face white with a fear that only fully released once she'd counted them both upright and breathing. two of the ranch hands arrived moments later, drawn by the bell and the glow lighting the whole yard orange, and set at once to hauling water and beating back embers that threatened to carry the fire toward the house itself. So that within the hour, the immediate danger had narrowed to the barn alone, and the Redmond homestead's other buildings stood safe under a hard, steady rain that seemed, at last, to be doing more good than harm. They collapsed together in the mud a safe distance off, both coughing, both soaked through, and Grace, checking his leg with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, found a bad bruise and no break, more mercy than either of them likely deserved for the recklessness of the last 10 minutes. "You could have died in there," she said, when she trusted her voice again, her hands still pressed to his chest as though she needed the proof of his heartbeat under her palms to fully believe he'd come out of that fire alive. "For horses, Asa. You could have died for horses." "I wasn't only thinking of the horses," he admitted hoarse, staring up at the rain-streaked sky rather than at her. "I've spent months now proving to Silas Crandall and half this valley that a one-armed man could still run a ranch, and somewhere in tonight's storm I decided I needed to prove something else besides, whether the man left over was still worth the trouble of saving. I went in there half hoping the answer would settle itself one way, and you went in after me and settled it the other way instead, at considerable risk to your own fool neck." "Because the answer was never in question for me, Asa Redmond," Grace said, fierce even through her exhaustion, cupping his soot-streaked face in both her hands. "It's only ever been in question for you, and I am so tired of watching you weigh a life I already know the worth of. You are not half a man. You never were. You are the whole and entire man I have loved since before that war ever took your arm, and I did not drag myself through fire and smoke tonight to lose you to your own despair after surviving everything else." He looked at her a long moment, rain running down both their faces, and something in him that had been held tight and guarded since that train platform finally, visibly, let go. "I have the ring still," he said. "I never could bring myself to give it to Mercy for keeping, though I told myself a dozen times I ought to." "I know you didn't," Grace said. "I've known it for weeks. A man ready to truly release a woman doesn't carry her ring in his coat pocket through a burning barn." The barn's ruins smoldered through what remained of that night, and the valley turned out in force the following week to help raise a new one. Silas Crandall notably absent from the effort, though several of his own hands came anyway, unwilling, it seemed, to let their employers' grudges dictate their neighborliness. Asa worked alongside the other men as much as his healing leg and single arm allowed, directing and hauling and laughing, twice, at jokes made plainly, and without any careful pity behind them. And Grace, watching him from the yard where she helped serve the noon meal to 24 tired workers, thought she had never in her life seen a man look more entirely, unguardedly alive. He came to her that evening, once the last wagon had rolled off down the North Fork Road, and Mercy had discreetly found reason to be elsewhere, and drew the ring from his coat pocket with a hand that no longer shook with shame, but only, she thought, with something closer to plain nervousness. "I've been a fool these 3 months, Grace Holloway, weighing my own worth on a scale that never once accounted for the one arm I do still have, or the one heart, which I find has never once stopped being entirely yours." He held the ring out, not to keep this time, but offered plain across his open palm. "I can't get down on one knee the way I once pictured doing this, on account of the leg still mending, but I'd be obliged if you'd put that ring back on my finger yourself, since you're better with your hands than I've managed to be with mine these last months, and since it was you who taught me that a task done differently isn't a task done lesser." Grace took the ring from his palm and slid it not onto her own finger, but onto his, The plain gold band she'd once worn herself now resting against a hand that had rebuilt a barn, and rigged a harness, and pulled a screaming mare from a burning stall, with nothing more than will and one good arm to work with. "There," she said, her voice thick with the whole winter's worth of held breath finally let go. "Now it's you who'll wear the proof of it, Asa Redmond, so that any man in this valley fool enough to doubt you again need only look at your hand to see a woman already decided the matter, and decided it for good." He laughed then, low and real, and drew her against his side with the one arm he had left. And Grace Holloway, who had stood on a train platform months before refusing to let a man's despair be the last word on his own worth, found that she had been right to refuse it, right to wait, right to walk into a burning barn after a man who had never, not for one single day since his return, stopped being entirely worth the saving. They married that spring, once the new barn stood finished, and the note to Silas Crandall lay paid in full, in a ceremony small enough to fit the whole of Northfork's genuine goodwill into one modest church. And Grace wore, pinned at her collar, a small scrap of scorched leather harness that Asa had kept from the very rig she'd fashioned for him that first autumn, a keepsake, he told her, of the exact moment he'd first begun to believe a life built differently might still be built whole. Widow Tanner sat in the front pew that day, guided to her seat by the same granddaughter who'd brought Asa back into the town's good graces one Christmas evening, and pressed his hand warmly as he passed, murmuring that she'd known, reading his letters through the war, that whatever the fighting cost him, the heart behind the words would come home steady. Mercy stood as witness beside Grace, radiant with a relief 2 years in the making, the homestead behind them finally solvent, and the note that had shadowed their whole winter settled clean. Grace thought, watching Asa wait for her at the front of that small church with his one good arm and his whole mended heart, of the ring she had once closed back into his palm on a train platform, refusing to take it before he was ready to believe he deserved to give it. She had waded through his despair and walked into a burning barn to prove her point, and she found, taking her place beside him at last, that she would have walked through considerably worse than fire for the plain, steady certainty of a love that had never once, in truth, gone missing along with anything the war had taken.